Welcome to week 3 in the class. This week we're going to be talking about what high quality classroom assessment looks like and some of the characteristics that it has. Chapter 3 in your text. Before we get into concepts like validity, reliability, etc., let's talk about the different types of assessment methods you might use in the classroom. Your book has a nice chart on page 60 that I'm going to be working from and explaining each of these different types. We're going to talk about 4 types: selected response, constructed response, teacher observation, and student assessment. So each of these different types measures knowledge or skills in a different way, and so you need to think about what's appropriate for you to use even while you're writing your lesson or learning objectives. Selected response consists of very brief, multiple choice, true, false, matching, and other types of things that don't require a lot of depth or thought. These items are great for student recall. So, for example, you might say, use it for science vocabulary. You might say, for example, the top level of classification used in the Linnaeus system is blank, and have 4 choices, and the student has to recall that the top level is kingdom. So these are again, they don't measure a lot of depth of knowledge, they just require that the student recall vocabulary or other basic knowledge. Constructed response requires a little deeper thought and learning, and each of the different types of constructive response requires deep learning, and some deeper than others. The first type of constructive response we'll talk about is the brief constructed response. You might know this as short answer. For example, in 3 or 4 sentences, explain how I might be able to divide a fraction. Diagram. Provide a picture with lines and ask the students to write the words that go on the line. Show your work in math as a type of constructive response. These are all classified as brief because they are quick and easy for you to do and score, but they don't measure deep knowledge. Performance tasks are especially appropriate for certain types of items that you want students to do something rather than just to write about it. So, for example, product performance tests, you might ask them to write a paper on a topic, or create a poem or a web page, do a journal entry, develop a graph, or construct a table for data. Skills focus more on things that students have to be able to do. Use skills like speech, debate, piano recital. They have to know how to play a piano to give a recital, keyboarding, etc. These are performance tasks. An essay is really excellent for very deep and extended knowledge. And there are 2 types of essays that we talk about: restricted response and extended response. The ALST, which many of you may have already taken, is an example of an essay that uses both restricted and extended response. Actually, the ALST uses several restricted responses, defined as shorter writing, to build you to quite a lengthy extended response, where you're required to pull together many different facts and interpretation of a graph. This gets at very deep learning. So if you have something that you're trying to teach, let's say more abstract at a middle school level, you might be trying to teach, for example, the role of conflict in wars. Then you're probably not going to measure or assess that with a multiple choice type of item. You're going to ask the students at least once, probably in the test, to write somewhere about the role of conflict. Oral questioning is used by teachers all the time. I wrote to several of you in your first discussion posting that we use informal assessment without even knowing it. Anytime you circulate in a room and ask students and try to assess their level of knowledge, you're using assessment. But oral questioning can also consist of, for example, examinations, very formal examinations. A doctoral candidate, a person trying to get a doctorate, is often subjected to oral questioning in his or her defense about his dissertation. Moving away from constructive response, we have assessment through teacher observation. This can be very formal or informal. For example, you might invite a school psychologist into your room to do a formal observation of a student who was exhibiting behavior issues. Or you might simply informally observe students or your class and reach decisions about behavior and learning ability and other type dispositions. These are also assessment. Student assessment means anytime a student assesses. So for example, if you ask students to fill out surveys about how they feel about something, how they think about something, they're assessing themselves. Self-evaluation on their own performance. I know I've done this where before a student will turn his or her work in, I'll give them a rubric and ask them to score their own work. And many times this is an excellent thing to do because it creates a situation where students are viewing their own work with a more critical eye. And then I'll give them a week or whatever to go home and make it better. Similarly, they can do the same type of thing and provide feedback on others' performances. So it's important to understand all these different types of assessment methods and to know you're probably going to use multiple ones in your classroom, and each of them has different outcomes and should be matched to the learning outcome that you want to use. Now we're going to turn from the type of assessments that you use in the classroom to how do you judge the quality of an assessment. And in talking about quality of assessments, we really have to consider four very important ideas: validity, reliability, fairness, and usability. A high quality assessment will demonstrate some degree of all of these. So let's get started, and first we're going to talk about validity. Validity has to do with the adequacy and appropriateness of the interpretations and uses of assessment results. So we always talk about validity in terms of, is the test or assessment being used appropriately? Tests have little validity or a lot of validity. And some researchers make the mistake of saying a test is valid or not. We always talk about it being valid for a particular use. Validity means the extent to which whatever it's measuring is well-founded and corresponds accurately to the instruction. So, for example, a test would not be considered a valid use of a test on multiplication wouldn't be given to a student who had only been taught addition. That wouldn't be a valid use of that test. This diagram is excellent in helping you understand that validity actually has several components. The four boxes on the bottom row, reliability, fairness, usability, and content, you may think of sort of as components of validity. In other words, if you're using a test to measure something, student knowledge, but you've mismatched the content, you don't have a very valid assessment there. Use of that assessment is not valid. If you have a test and it doesn't measure the same way each time, which is, we'll speak about reliability in a minute, but that's what reliability is, then you can't have, the use isn't valid. So reliability is actually subsumed under validity. You can't have validity without adequate or good reliability. You can have a reliable test that's not valid, but you can't have a valid test that's not reliable. When we discuss validity, it's important to keep in mind several points. First of all, when we discuss the validity surrounding an assessment, it's always a matter of degree. Think of validity as a continuum. On one side of the continuum, there's a little bit of validity. On the other side of the continuum, there's a great deal of validity. Of course, we want our assessments to have a lot of validity because it means we're using them correctly in a correct purpose, in a correct manner, and we should have a good assessment then. So we always want a assessment being used in a situation for which it's appropriate and for which there'll be a lot of validity. We always talk about validity for. So, for example, suppose you have two groups of students in your classroom, and one group comes from a very rural area, and one group comes from the inner city. If you construct a test with items that talk about farm combines and hay reapers and things like that, half of your class might score very well, but the other half might not because they're not familiar, they don't have the context for those terms. So in a sense, that test might be valid for the rural students, but not valid for the inner city students. And there are many different situations, not just groups of students, but ability levels you have to take into consideration, learning styles perhaps, and many, many other characteristics. Validity must also be inferred from evidence. And so what this means is we can't directly measure anything really, if you think about it. Let's take something simple. Let's say you teach a unit on, I've been using science examples, so I'll use something different. Let's say you teach a unit on verbs, and you've taught this unit for 4 weeks, and you think your fourth graders have mastered all types of verbs and understand verb conjugations and how to use verbs, etc. Think about that. Is it really possible to construct even a multiple choice test that has all the knowledge about verbs that you've taught? Probably not. The students would be testing for days. And so what you try to do is you try to pick a sample of questions from perhaps each learning objective or learning target and say, okay, I'm adequately measuring what I've been taught. However, you might not have correctly sampled the objectives. You might not have phrased the questions in the right way. So we learned that all assessment has some type of error built in. When you start to talk about dispositions and measuring dispositions, it's even more difficult. So say, for example, you're a math teacher and you want to do a little survey that measures how much students like math. So you do a survey and you ask them to rate how much they like math, and you get the scores back. Many things could have interfered with that assessment. For example, you might have just given a hard test the day before, and a student that normally likes math may be having a bad day thinking about math. Your assessment might say things like a little, a lot, somewhat. And what do those really mean? They might mean different things to different people. So we have to think about the error that's in testing and use other types of evidence that we're going to be talking about in just a minute to infer that our test is valid, or the use of our test is valid for a particular topic. So the important thing to remember here is that all assessment has some error built in, and we're trying to determine how much error and make sure that it's not so much that we wind up with an assessment being used for a purpose that's not valid. Because if it's used for a purpose that's not valid, we can't really count on the scores. And if we can't count on the scores, we can't really say that students are learning, we can't understand what they know, etc. We talked about how validity requires evidence because we have to determine whether our assessment contains too much error to use. 3 sources of evidence for validity are content validity, criterion validity, and construct validity. And these are actually different types of validity that you can use and use with simple procedures in the classroom. Let's consider content validity. Content validity is the extent to which the assessment matches up to the content that was taught and how it was taught. So 2 different types of things there. So let's say you are a kindergarten teacher, and you're trying to assess students. You don't use a lot of tests and quizzes in kindergarten, I hope, but you might be trying to assess them after you've taught a particular unit on counting. And so if you have them count in circle and you have them count with partner pairs and you do all of these performance-based counting activities, and then when you're trying to assess them at the end, if you ask them to find the two green books on the page, you might be having a trouble with content validity because you haven't taught them colors. Let's assume you haven't taught them colors. And so there's a little bit of a mismatch between what you've taught them, the content, and what is being assessed. Also, that performance assessment, or that pencil and paper task for the kindergartner might not be appropriate because you've used performance teaching. You've asked them to do things. Count in group, circle, count in partner pairs, for example. So a better and a more authentic matchup might be to ask them to see if they can do it on their own with you, performing it in front of you. Criterion validity is also another source of evidence for validity. This is a little confusing, but basically it means the relationship between an assessment and another measure of the same trait. Think about using multiple assessments in your classroom. Instead of just giving one test, for example, to cover knowledge gained, you might try giving 2 or 3 different assessments over time. So, for example, if you have taught a unit on, let's use social studies, if you've taught a unit on townships, what is it that makes a town and what kinds of things go into a town, the police department, the fire department, etc., and you develop an assessment and measure that, you might also just use an informal assessment of discussion at the end, noting which child seems to understand. And you might use the criterion validity as the comparison of the two. So if your verbal discussion with the group matches the results you're seeing on your test, or you could give a second assessment down the road, and if the results match up, you're using one form of assessment to say that the other form is a valid use because they're matching up. Let's suppose you were a math teacher and you decided to give a test on addition and subtraction, and perhaps the same students did well on the addition test and the subtraction test. Well, you might make an argument that these students are learning the arithmetic operations, and those 2 tests provide criterion validity for each other. Construct validity is a more abstract concept. Construct validity is the extent to which the assessment is a meaningful measure of an observable trait or characteristic. And so if you think back to the survey example that I gave you, do you like math? We might have trouble with the construct validity on that one because, like I said, you might have caught different students different days after the big test, and they don't particularly like math, but they generally like math overall. So you've got to find another way to say, yes, this properly captured and measured the construct of whether a student likes math. And so when you're researching, there's some pretty sophisticated statistical techniques that you would do, but again, you're not going to do that in the classroom. So you might just, again, develop other measures such as grades. Students that like math, if they get A's in your class, that might be a measure of construct validity. One of the goals in determining whether an assessment is being used for a valid purpose is to think about it is in terms of content validation, and specifically to determine the extent to which a set of assessment tests provides a relevant and representative sample of the domain of task about which interpretations of assessment results are made. What that means is When you're planning assessments, whether they're tests or performance-based assessments or any other type, you need to think about your learning outcomes and what's been taught. And not only do you need to think about the objectives or learning outcomes, you need to think about how much time you spent teaching them. Let's say you have 5 learning outcomes that you've taught in a unit, and you spent maybe half of the unit time on one particular learning outcome because it was a particularly complex one. Well, you want about half of your questions on the test to be focused on that one learning outcome. If you focused, 90% of your test questions on the other 4 outcomes, then you're giving a little bit of a weight and too much of a de-emphasis on the thing that you taught. When we're talking about content validity and understanding that what we need to assess needs to be taught, it's important to go back and review the alignment that needs to occur between standards, learning objectives, and targets. These should all be flowing seamlessly. Ideally, your standards are going to dictate what's in your curriculum. Many of these standards come from either a national or a state level, although there are district standards as well. So it's important to understand in your own particular situation by asking your principal or by asking another teacher what's the body of standards you're using in each domain. Aligning with those standards are the learning objectives and targets that we talked about last week. So remember that learning objectives and targets are much more specific and usually more detailed than the standards. Many objectives and targets will go into supporting a standard. And flowing out of this are your assessment. So once you've identified what should be taught, then you have to assess what was taught. And there has to be a complete alignment and match between this. You wouldn't have a standard, for example, that says that students will understand the role of technology in advancing the 20th century and having a learning objective or target that breaks that down into understanding or demonstrating the advances that computers have helped us make, and then assess on something completely different. For example, the role of something from the 18th century, for example. So there has to be complete alignment between these 3 items. Another thing we need to talk about, one of the components that affects validity, is reliability. And reliability usually refers to consistency of assessment results. That is, if the test or assessment is administered again and again and again to the same students, you would get the same result, unless of course you taught that student or had an intervention of some type. So let's say I'm teaching a unit in math on let's say multiplying, and I give a student a test with 10 problems, and they fail the test, the student fails the test, and then I give the student the test again the next day. They're going to fail it again, most likely because they haven't had any intervention. Now, if I do an intervention or I do a teaching moment, then you would expect the student's scores to go up. But again, reliability is how reliably does it measure in the same way again and again and again. Again, it's concerned with consistency of results rather than the appropriateness of interpretations made from the results. That's validity. So you could have a test that's poorly measuring what you taught, but it's still reliable again and again and again. That's why we say that reliability is a component of validity, but you don't have to have a valid test for it to be reliable. I could have a test that doesn't measure multiplication very well, but it would give me the same results again and again and again. An important point to note yet again is the relationship between validity and reliability. Reliability, consistency of measurement, is needed to obtain valid results. In other words, you have to have reliability before you can have validity. But you can have reliability without validity. So you can measure something consistently, but it be used measuring the wrong information or inappropriately. So again, you have to have reliability to obtain validity, but you don't have to have validity to obtain reliability. Besides validity and reliability, high-quality assessments exhibit fairness. Fairness has to do with, is it appropriate for you to be asking the students, to be assessing the students on something because they've been taught, because they have the prerequisite skills ready to learn it, because of a variety of reasons. To ensure fairness, again, this goes, I've been saying this again and again, but your learning targets should match the assessments. If you have a learning target and let's say, and the learning target has to do with, let's go back to science again, with understanding how stars form, then you're not going to be giving an assessment containing questions on how planets form, unless that is another learning target that's been covered. Student knowledge of learning targets and assessments, this refers to the fact that we need to share our learning targets with students. We need to talk to them about what it is that we expect them to learn. I know a lot of teachers like to put the objectives or learning targets on the board. They announce them at the beginning today of the session. Even very young children you can do this with. You can say, today, boys and girls, we're going to be learning 3 colors, green, red, and blue. Fairness also has to do with whether students have been given an opportunity to learn the concept. As I explained earlier, you don't put items on an assessment if you haven't taught them. Prerequisite knowledge and skills. If, for example, a student is given a test in math, and in order to understand or complete the problem accurately, they have to be at a certain reading level, then perhaps if they don't have that prerequisite reading skill, it's not that they're going to be inaccurate in the math, it's just they can't do the problem because they aren't at the reading level required for the problem. So you need to think about all kinds of skills that are included in your questions, and do the students have the necessary knowledge and skills to be able to do them? You need to avoid student stereotyping, and along with this, bias in assessment tasks and procedure. I think we talked about the rural students, for example, who might know of a combine. You need to avoid stereotyping. I think the book gave an example of a question that dealt with a Hispanic father who was making very low income. And, this can quite reasonably deter students or give them a negative impression of certain groups. So it's very important that you think about stereotyping and bias in your assessment. You need to be able to accommodate diverse learners. And we have so many types of diversity in our classroom. We have students who are very advanced, for example, or students who are struggling. Those are the most common issues that assessments deal with. Do you have perhaps teaching going on in your classroom for the more advanced students? That's a little more challenging. It's appropriate to give them a different assessment if they've been taught different content, for example. The last component of high-quality assessments that we'll be discussing today is usability. Many times as teachers, we construct very elaborate, time-intensive, or even costly assessments when a simpler one would do. There are several guiding characteristics of usable assessments. First of all, they are practical and efficient. You're familiar with the method and students are familiar with the method. One of the worst things you can do in terms of usability is make an assessment that is very cumbersome for you to grade. So you might want to, when you are, let's say, creating a test, you might want to have a student that age take the test and time him or her. You could take the test yourself to see how long it takes. You could have the student take the test ahead of time and then grade it. And so you can get a sense for how long it will take you, time required. Um, you also could use a grading rubric, which is something that we often do at the college level. We'll share a grading rubric when your syllabus has one about how we're going to grade your paper. And these things can be shared with students up front as well. Student familiarity with method is important to think about. Let's say you are assessing students using a Venn diagram and asking them to place items into one circle or another, or the overlap. Well, if you've never worked with students on how to do a Venn diagram, you can't appropriately use it as an assessment method. It's not usable for the students. Ease of administration and ease of scoring, we've already talked a little bit about. Ease of interpretation is when you score it, is it clear-cut what you're going to be looking at? Are the results easily understood by both you and the student? And finally, cost. There's some very costly, mostly standardized tests out there that are sometimes appropriate to use, but probably your school should be making the decision to buy those assessments. Now it's time to review the big ideas from the lecture, the things that I'd like you ideally to come away with. The first point is that assessments should be matched with learning targets and aligned with standards. Again, as we talked about in an earlier slide, that match is critical if you want to have valid and reliable assessment. Also, it's important to think about the type of assessment items to most appropriately use. You wouldn't want to, for example, use multiple choice items to measure an in-depth thinking question. And finally, it's important to understand validity, reliability, fairness, and usability, and think about them as you're developing your assessments, always being conscious and aware of their components. So that concludes this week's lecture, and I hope that you're having a great day or a great weekend, and more to come.